Welcome, brave souls, to the chilling depths of horror and detail, the realm where the shadows whisper ancient secrets and nightmares come to life. I am your guide through the darkness, and on this channel, we delve into the spine-chilling world of werewolf horror stories that will send shivers down your spine. First story. I walked home alone last night and narrowly made it out alive. Before I get the kind of lecture I'd expect from my father, I know that it's a risky move to walk home alone at night. I know, especially as a young woman, that it's unsafe, that anything could happen. Okay, I know. That being said, I come from a remarkably safe area. The kind of place where people don't shoot up in bed worried because they can't remember if they lock their doors. I've stumbled home drunk more than a few times myself, only to discover my keys long forgotten in the lock outside the next morning. Nobody really worried because nothing bad really happened here, not until a few months ago. Up until now, it wasn't actually considered that dangerous to walk alone after dark here. I did it pretty often myself. I don't have a car, and the public transportation system here is basically non-existent. I'm saving up to finally get myself a vehicle, but it's a bit of a vicious cycle. I can't afford a car, and the relative safety it would afford me. So to get one, I have to work. And I'm a bartender, so that means working late shifts. There's been a recent spate of killings in my town, the first of its kind. Really, we've seen a startling number of victims who've all met their end at the hands of a frenzied knife attacker over the past few months. And the murders are all brutal beyond belief. The victims are stabbed to the point of death, and then some, past the point of recognition. Complete overkill. First it was one murder every so often, but now sometimes multiple victims are found after a single night. All of these people were simply going about their business as usual, walking home after dark from work or a friend's place or the store. Many of them died just yards from the safety and comfort of their homes, some mere steps away from their front doors. We've been forced to confront the fact that we almost certainly have a serial killer on our hands. With all of this weighing heavy on my mind, I guess you'll all understand why I was terrified to find myself out on the street hours past nightfall and out of options. Surprisingly, I wasn't leaving a shift last night that I can plan for, and I actually have started carpooling with my coworkers over the past couple weeks. After realizing I was either out or working a startling amount of the nights when the killer added another victim to his count, I figured I needed to take these extra measures to ensure my safety. I was actually leaving my boyfriend's, ex-boyfriend's, house late last night after we got into a huge fight. It started with the same old stuff. He's incredibly jealous, aggressively possessive. Despite my being faithful for the several years we've been together, he's never learned to trust me. He's always going on and on about my phone, insisting that if I don't respond to him, then I must be cheating. He was drunk, belligerent, and he wouldn't let it go last night. He pointed out several recent windows of time when I should have texted back, failing to realize that, because these instances were in the middle of the night, I was either working or sleeping like any other normal person. The fight started at around 2 a.m. and ended over an hour later. He seriously broke my phone, then kicked me out with no way to call for help. I had no cash on hand and no way to call a cab anyway. The buses had stopped running for the night, and the walk to the nearest bus stop probably would have been longer than the walk back home. I was drunk and alone and scared and helpless. I briefly considered knocking on a neighbor's door, but stopped myself. I didn't want to make a fuss. I could just walk home on my own. It wasn't a big deal. It'd only take me about 15 minutes. After all, I'd done it plenty of times before. With a renewed, or feigned, more likely, sense of courage, I plodded down the steps outside my ex's house and onto the sidewalk. I tried desperately not to think of the serial attacker But it was no use. I couldn't silence my thoughts about what scared me most about the maniac. His preferred victims. It was his lack of preference that worried me most. Actually, it sounds horrible to say, but in that moment, I couldn't deny the thought. If he only went for a certain kind of victim, like petite blonde girls, I'd have felt safer. As I continued my walk, I thought back on all of his victims, realizing that there was no common thread that could stitch his choice of victims together. There was no neat box that I could categorize them in, all in the name of making myself feel safer. Even more horrifying still, several men had fallen victim to the killer. Big men that sure as hell put up a fight, yet stood no chance against such vicious knife attacks. Chillingly, such a variety in victims communicated one thing to me, and as I turned down the next street, about halfway through my walk, then, the message was suddenly loud and fucking clear. His motives to kill didn't come from the normal things I'd expect. He didn't hate his mom. He wasn't angry at his first girlfriend for leaving him. He wasn't killing a specific type of victim to live out his fantasies of vengeance against those he'd felt had wronged him. He killed for one reason and one reason alone. He loved to do it. With this realization, I found myself walking at a brisk pace, much quicker than usual. Before the onslaught of brutal killings, I used to enjoy my walks home, used to savor the quiet of the town after dark. It used to feel like the world belonged to me, like everything had slowed down for my enjoyment alone, like I was the only person left on the planet. Last night, it was different, a slight difference, but one that made a monumental impact. In my mind, I wasn't the only person anymore. Instead, it was just me and the knife-wielding fiend, hell-bent on my destruction, just the hunter and its prey. I tried to silence these thoughts, tried in vain to reassure myself that we hadn't seen an attack in a little over 2 weeks. For a few moments, these internal reassurances actually worked. Perhaps it was the buzz I still had going. I felt myself start to calm, though I remained vigilant. I had to be. My senses were on high alert so that I wouldn't get caught off guard. It was probably because of this heightened vigilance that I heard the sound from behind me, the first sign to prove that I was as far from alone as I feared. Before I'd even registered the disturbance, my head whipped around instinctively to look back over my shoulder. It was hard to see at first, but once I saw a quiver of movement in the distance, my stomach bottomed out and hit the ground. There was a man behind me, dressed head to toe in black. He was walking quite quickly himself, with purpose, and I wasn't about to stick around and find out what exactly his purpose was. I felt frozen in place for a moment, but once my body caught up with me, we were on our way further down the street. I was only a couple blocks away from my house at that point, and my feet carried me as fast as they could, but my shoes were uncomfortable and I found it hard to move. I could still hear him shuffling along behind me, his footfalls coming at a disturbingly fast pace. From the sounds alone, I figured I'd hardly expanded the gap between us. He was in quick pursuit. I wagered a second glance over my shoulder. Big mistake. Like some true horror movie shit, I toppled over. Reflexively, I threw my hands out in front of me so that my palms made harsh contact with the paved sidewalk. I knew I had to get up, though, because his steps were growing much louder. I began to panic as I realized that this not only because he was closer to me, but because he'd started to run. Fast. Adrenaline surged through me, urging me to scramble to my feet and get home, or at least to get help. I don't think I was even in control of my body anymore. I'd relinquished all operating power to my most basic, primal self, commanded only by the will to survive. I figure this must be true, that I must have set all cognitive processes aside in favor of escape and survival, because I startled awake this morning, at home. I woke up in bed, naked, hungover, with a foul taste in my mouth that took a few times brushing my teeth to get rid of. I'm a little worn out, but I'm safe. I don't look much like I was in a fight for my life, just some scrapes and bruises here and there. My fingernails are surprisingly dirty, with some substance caked underneath them, probably dirt from when I fell. It's hard to say exactly what happened, though. The adrenaline rush that came over me was so powerful that I have only a hazy recollection of the entire night that, of course, in conjunction with the alcohol, my survival instincts must have carried me those last few minutes until I burst through my door. It was a close call, for sure, but even closer when I opened my laptop to a news alert. Apparently, a morning jogger found a man's body, another victim of the killer. There are few details available now, but he was found on the same street I'd been pursued on last night, likely to have been killed near the same time I'd escaped. One of the detectives on the case reported that he expected an identification to be difficult, seeing as the victim had been nearly ripped to shreds. Like I said, I don't exactly remember what happened last night, but I'm comforted by the fact that I was so close to death, but that I made it home safe. I'm exhausted and I certainly look a little rough, but I'm okay. And that's something to be grateful for, don't you think? Second story. I work as a zookeeper for the Amarillo Zoo and I know what the creature is. I'm writing this on a burner account for anonymity's sake. I could get into some real trouble for doing this, since I'm revealing shit that only the zoo management really knows. Before we get hired, most of us sign a DNA. It's the standard stuff, but it means if anyone finds out who wrote this, I could be in some serious legal trouble. I attempted to post this on 4chan, but the asshats over there largely ignored it, or told me I was a fucking liar. Maybe you guys will hear me out though. Even if you don't, I need to get this out of my mind. So, about that photo. It's a photo from security camera footage at the zoo, as you all probably already know. The city finally released it to the public on Twitter because, long story short, they're scared shitless. We all are. I've never believed in supernatural shit or cryptozoology, seeing as I've been working with and studying real animals for most of my life. But I don't have words for what we've experienced lately. I'm genuinely incapable of explaining it. Science doesn't touch shit like this, and I'm at a loss to explain it beyond the conclusions we've all come to, which I'll explain later on. All of this started about 2 months ago or so, back in April. I was with a few other zookeepers, doing the usual routine, cleaning up pens, feeding the animals and whatnot. It was somewhat late at night, after closing time, about 11 p.m. or so. I'm filling the feed in the exotic bird area, when I notice 2 or 3 parrots are dead. This was obviously concerning to us, as we all care a lot about the animals we care for. We aren't exactly flushed with cash, and Amarillo Zoo, although popular, doesn't make a lot of money. Losing critters out of nowhere can be a real blow to revenue, since it can cost a lot to replace the animals. Anyways, I'm getting off track. Point is, birds dead. Out of nowhere, might I add. It was only a few, sure, but if they kept dropping off like that, it would be bad news. So I let the other zookeepers know about it, and we decided to search the cage. Perhaps some snot-nosed kid had fed the birds something poisonous, or maybe there was an illness or virus spreading among the birds. This was nothing too big, so when we let management know about it the next day, they largely shrugged it off. We sent the carcasses to a vet to get them tested anyways, to see what killed them. Well, the tests the vet's office did turn nothing back. Like, at all. No poisons, no evidence of illness even. Not so much as a feather out of place. They had just dropped dead. It was weird, but we sort of forgot about it. A few weeks later, we find more animals dead. We find 3 goats, largely in the same manner as the birds. We got them tested too, because clearly this was not something random. Management catches wind of this, so we start beefing up security and keeping an eye on visitors. We start making more announcements to not feed the animals, etc. You guys might not know this, but zookeepers have a pretty demanding schedule. It can vary by zoo, but many of us sleep in bunks at the zoo, so we can take care of the animals 24/7. You know, in case a lion or chimp breaks out and we need to make another Harambe meme, which was tragic, by the way. We tend to rotate in schedules so each of us gets the chance to sleep at home a few days a week. So in addition to the other stuff, we start taking turns watching the security footage at night. The deaths don't stop happening though, and we aren't seeing shit at night. In early May, we noticed a few of the sheep in our petting zoo section missing. They just straight up vanished. It was very frustrating. By this point, we start getting the police involved. We call them up and tell them what's been happening. They say they'll leave an officer around along with our security to watch things at night until the weird stuff stops happening. We zookeepers start really watching our security cameras too. Whatever was happening, it was probably some crafty creep who got a kick out of killing animals for fun. Me and my colleagues were getting pissed too. The animals were clearly stressed, and a few of them stopped eating regularly. We hated the thought of someone trying to hurt innocent animals for fun. Well, then the really scary stuff starts happening. We get up in the morning and find the sheep that were missing, or what was left of them. Their skins were all we found, strewn about the sidewalk near the zoo's entrance. We knew it was our sheep because their ID tags were included with the fur. Police say they didn't see anything the night before. Security says the same thing. We are all baffled. We manage to get all cleared up before the zoo opens. We decide to keep the strange happenings under wrap so as to not alert the fucker doing this. We don't want them to know we're onto it. A full day passes without incident. We had a normal day the next day too, when at night, I hear a bunch of shouting. It was around 2 a.m., and the security guard is running for his life. He's shouting for the cops and is shaking all over. Says he saw something climb over the wall to the lion exhibit. Says it was covered in fur. The police have him show them us where it's at, and when all get there, there's nothing. We check the security footage, and all we manage to capture is some movement in the darkness in the lion's area. Security guard is crying and shit saying it was a werewolf. We laugh him out of the room. He keep insisting it was a werewolf. Like something out of Harry Potter, he says. We laugh at him. We're sure at this point it was probably some coyote or some shit that managed to find a way into the zoo at night. The sheepskin was weird, but maybe the thing had been eating the carcass nearby in the wooded area nearby the zoo. It's called Thompson Memorial Park. It's small, but it could hide a coyote or two. The shit doesn't stop though. We start finding organs in the enclosures, just out of nowhere. And they weren't random. Intestines, in the shape of a heart on the floor of the porcupine exhibit. 2 sheep eyeballs in the holes of our wooden fences. We had been watching the cameras, and we couldn't really see anything except for quick flashes of white from time to time. The animals were still acting strange. Normally friendly animals suddenly just stayed in their sleeping areas, even when fed. We were really freaked out at this point, and the police started sending more officers to patrol the zoo at night. It all culminated on May 21st. It was 3 a.m., usual night. It was quiet out, and I was watching the cameras with a security guard. We were looking at one of the outside camera areas when we fucking notice it. The photo above captures exactly what we saw. I shit a fucking brick when I saw it. At first, it sort of reminded me of that coyote asshole who was walking around during the 2021 Capitol riots in D.C. Some guy wearing a coyote pelt on his body. But it wasn't right. Its limbs were strangely animalistic, and yet still strangely human. Not only that, but I don't know if any of you have noticed, it was holding some kind of stick. It was doing this weird freezing jerking motion. It would pace and then freeze. It would stay perfectly still. Then it would jitter about and start pacing again. We phoned the police, obviously, and say there's an intruder on the fence, that it might be our guy. Well, 3 or 4 officers go right towards the fence. I'm out there since I want to see this sick fuck get arrested. The police decide to split up and they point their guns at it. They start yelling at it to stop right where it is and not to move and that it was under arrest. Things starts heaving. The security footage uses night vision, so it may seem like we could see it easily, but in real life it was pitch black out. They get their flashlights out and point it at this thing. It's the scariest shit I've ever seen in my life. Eyes totally devoid of color, just milky white like some kind of demon. Sharp-ass teeth. I begin to wonder if that security guy was right after all. Maybe it was some sort of werewolf. But I've had time to think about it, and the moon wasn't full that day. It sounds fucking childish and dumb. But when you've seen something so unexplainable to you start reaching for straws trying to figure it out. So the thing is making this jittery movement, and it starts to sound there, this rattling. Sort of like when you hear sprinklers go off in your yard. Thing is furry as hell, and the police start yelling louder, 'cause it's moving towards the officers on the other side of the fence. It starts screaming, and it was the most god-awful sound. Like boiling a puppy alive. The officers are terrified like we all were, and they start shooting at it. I've never seen anything like it. Thinking about it now makes me want to cry, like seriously. It took 5 shots dead center in the chest, and to the fucking head, and didn't even flinch. The officers see this and shoot at it more. But it just takes it, without so much as a flinch, still screaming, but louder now. It suddenly moves lightning fast and is on the other side of the fence. I gasped and started running. I could hear its screams and the rattling. Officers realize their guns are fucking useless against this thing, and they start backing away. We all start booking it back to the zookeeper's bunk area. We sat in that room, and the officers called in backup. Meanwhile, the thing was jerking its way around the enclosure and making its way around the zoo. We waited in the security camera room, watching the security cameras and waiting for the other police to come. We watched this thing walk in the zoo like it's nothing, jittering around in its weird fucking way. We can hear it screaming to some extent still. Suddenly, we watch as the thing vanishes. I can't really describe it. It was there, and then suddenly it wasn't. The backup arrives, and they search the park. Officers take our stories. They find nothing in the zoo. We check the footage again. We have it on camera. We didn't have good footage of it inside the zoo, but the footage outside the fence is crystal clear. We are all freaked out. I didn't sleep a wink that night. We start debating about what it was to pass the time. It's all we can talk about when we get to work. We wonder if it was a werewolf. Agree that werewolf is a bad explanation. We start wondering if it's an alien, or a demon, or some shit. One of our colleagues, though, says he knows what it is. Says he's heard stories about things like it when he was growing up in Arizona. He mentions what he thinks it is, and I realize I've actually heard of the thing before too. Given everything we had seen, it makes a lot of sense and matches up with everything. I'm not going to say what it is here. If the legends I've heard are true, and I believe they are 100% true now, it's bad mojo to even talk about them. It's some dark and evil shit that the Navajo take very fucking seriously. If you still can't figure out what I'm talking about by now, Google Navajo and scary stories. That should bring up all you need to know. All I need to know is that one of those is stalking the zoo. The footage is remarkable. Made it to the mayor's office. It has had the police department totally stumped. It has had the entire city spooked. They've been looking at that footage over and over again, trying to come up with a rational explanation. They can't. That's why the city of Amarillo tweeted out the footage. A lot of people have taken this all as a joke, but I assure you none of us are laughing. We are all fucking terrified. The whole world knows now. The only good news about all of this is that the weird shit has stopped happening. We still hear rattling at night, though, when we're walking around the zoo. You might have noticed the zoo put out a statement saying no animals had died. That's technically true, but only because we had listed the earlier deaths as natural. That was before we realized they weren't. I'm typing all this right now on very little sleep. I haven't been able to sleep well since I've seen that thing's eyes. I've finally had a day or two off zoo duty, so I'm at home typing this. I'm using a VPN, so hopefully no one can trace this post back to me. But maybe I suppose I shouldn't mind if I get fired. Truth is, at this point, I'm not sure I want to go back. Third story. I've researched a werewolf sighting for years. Actually, accounts I've heard vary. Some, like Rob's or Aldo's, sound more like a wercat or werbear. The moon shone into the diner, 2 days past full. I spotted its reflection in the pie cooler's glass door. Spinning my stool so I faced the plate glass window, I saw it hanging above my bearded reflection like a brilliant idea or a second bald head. Wired from my fourth cup of coffee, I tilted my head back and quietly howled, "Aruro," or Carrie elbowed me. "Knock it off, hairball. People trying to eat. Hey, you got more hair than I do." Down the counter, Sophia frowned. "You shouldn't though, Jacob. It's not respectful." That surprised me. Respectful to who? To the people who were killed. Say what? Carrie said. What people? Oh, yeah, Rob agreed, the other side of Sophia. For a few years, Drunken Tree had a bigger murder rate than Argenta. Argenta's 8 or 10 times the size of Drunken Tree Village and has a university besides. See, Sophia said, there was a werewolf here. Carrie laughed. Aroo. By now Sophia's frown tightened half her throat. I'm serious. Shut up and listen, would ya? Okay, sorry. There were a bunch of people in here one night, and a guy comes in. He orders 3 hamburgers and sits down. But people hear him growling, and all of a sudden he sprouts hair and claws and shit. What was he taking? I asked, rubbing my smooth scalp. I could use some of it. If I'd had any hair, Sophia's glare would have shriveled it. Y'all think this is a joke. It's not. People died. People die every day, Soph, Carrie said. Just tell your story. Wait, was it a full moon? That's what I heard. Well, first he clawed up the cook, because his burgers took too long. Then everybody started trying to run out the door, and they got all jammed up. And the werewolf ripped off a guy's head, and the rest of the people broke the doors out. He chased them into the street, and killed a girl there. Wow, Carrie said, subdued. I didn't know. 2 people died, and the cook was crippled, and some other people got sort of trampled. And the werewolf ran off, and nobody ever figured out who he was. Carrie picked up a French fry, looked at the ketchup, laid it down again. That's messed up. I had to agree. I'd researched that night for years, and never heard a more garbled version. Rob also agreed, it turned out. Geez, Sophia, you got nearly everything wrong. I started to worry the frown would freeze on her face. What do you know about it? She asked. More in you. I was here. I heard a snort by the cash register. Sure you were. The counterman, Aldo by his name tag, had gotten interested. Half the university was here that night, if you believe everyone. He stepped closer. No offense, kid, but if 1/10 the people that say they were here really were, this place would have looked like the biggest phone booth stuffing stunt in history. Rob shrugged. I was though. So were you. And that black cook, Jerome. You used to wear a red apron. Hey, yeah, I did. That thing saved my balls that night. Jerome dropped his flipper, crawling under the counter. and I slipped on the grease and hit the fryer. Splashed hot grease all over my front. I shucked that apron faster than Gypsy Rosalie. If it hadn't been so thick, IDA probably fried my man bits. He looked at Rob more closely. Where were you? Rob pointed down the counter's length. I'm the one who broke out that window. He leaned forward, elbows on the counter. You see. Sophia cut him off, gaping at Aldo. You saw that night, and you still work here? Why shouldn't I? I gotta work somewhere. Well, but what if he came back? Aldo chuckled. What? You think he misses our burnt sugar pie? Her voice low and throaty, Carrie said, That's why I come here. We all laughed. Seriously, though, no reason he should come back here. It's probably just an accident he was here at all, just passing through. But the memories, how can you? Sophia looked at us, baffled. They should have closed this place, she said, a little loudly, or put up a plaque or something. Oh God, Rob said. I bet you leave flowers at roadside crosses. He struck home with that. Tears flashing, Sophia said, My cousin was killed on Highway 207. My sister and I put up a cross for her. So, it's not enough your cousin's dead. You gotta make total strangers feel bad.
People die Sofe.
You gotta grieve and go on. It's not fair to try and make the whole world grieve. She pulled a 20 out of her purse and shoved it blindly at Carrie.
I gatego kropka.
She ran out the door, tears in her eyes. That was pretty shitty, Carrie said. Rob looked abashed. Yeah, well, I really hate those crosses. Come on, Jacob, back me up. I shook my head. I don't like those crosses. I'm not big on grief, but Carrie's right. That was shitty. I didn't mind, though. Sophia had nothing useful for me. Aldo had already cleared away Sophia's dishes and laid her check by Carrie's plate. No rush, he said. I said, So what happened that night? Carrie looked at me and shrugged. Okay, yeah, what happened? Watching for Carrie to object, Rob slid onto Sophia's stool. I was here with a girl. I can't even remember her name anymore. We were sitting over there. He pointed at a short row of two-person booths. I didn't see the guy come in. He was alone at the counter and just starts growling and snarling. And he grows these giant claws, like a bear. He stands up, and all of a sudden he's like 7 feet tall. People are screaming and running for the door. Aldo nodded. Rob went on. A big guy, biker type, tries to get the guy in a headlock. The guy just reaches behind him and rips the biker guy's belly open, like it was paper. Now, when the bear guy first stood up, he broke his stool right off the floor. Aldo interrupted. The inspector made Cliff replace all the stools after that. Said they weren't sturdy enough. Well, I'm lucky that one broke. It fell right by our booth. The bear guy and the biker were fighting, and everybody else was pushing at the front door, and I just grabbed that stool and heaved it through the side window. My date and I jumped out and ran like hell, and a bunch of people came after us. That's where the other girl was killed. She tried to jump out the window and fell on broken glass. Cut her belly open. I winced. Rob sipped his coffee. Freaky thing is, the bear guy didn't hurt anybody until the biker jumped him. He could have claimed self-defense. Ain't that how it went, Aldo? The counterman said, Be right back, and went to ring up a family. Staring at Rob, Carrie reached blindly for her soda. I took her hand and guided it. She faced me, pale and quiet, eyes wide. I shrugged. I wasn't here. That really happened? She turned back. Rob, you really saw that? Yeah. Never been so shit scared in my life. Except for the '09 tornado. Guy was a complete freak. Didn't grow hair, though. Just got huge and grew claws. That's right. No hair. Aldo was back. I'm gonna tell Darla she ought to rename this place Rashomon. I knew what he meant, but the others looked blank. Say what? Carrie said. Rashomon? The Kurosawa movie? What's Kurosawa? Rob asked. Some kind of anime? He's a movie director. Geez, you kids don't watch anything wasn't made this millennium. I didn't bother telling him I preferred Kurosawa's Stray Dog. Anyway, Rashomon's about 4 people telling the same story, only they all see it different and tell it different. Carrie got the hint. So what's your version? He ticked a finger at Rob. You didn't get so much wrong as that little girl you ran off, but you didn't get it all right either. He came in, kinda shaggy-haired but nothing freaky, with a girl, same as you. They sat at the counter. I got 'em both burgers, and they started eating, and by I notice he's looking upset. She's looking real serious, and I think, oh, she's giving him the Dear John. Next thing I know, he's out and out crying. Not out loud, but just running tears and kinda hiccuping, you know? I think. She's gonna walk out, now, but instead she puts her arms around him. And his face is just like a dam's breaking inside. He lets go this one big sob, and then his face just... He stopped at a loss. His face just grows, except that's not really it. There's more behind his face. And then he stands up. I heard the stool break, didn't know what it was, watching him. He was bigger and taller. You're right there. He must have been over 7 foot. And he's got claws. No fangs, though. Not like people said. Just the same teeth. And no new hair. Carrie grinned. Sorry, Jacob. Jerome's diving under the sink. That's when I slipped and hit the fryer. Time I got my apron off, he'd already killed the one guy and the place is nuts. I saw a guy throw the stool through the glass. That was you? That guy had black hair, all dressed in black. Rob ran a hand over his sandy hair. I was doing a goth thing then. Even had black nail polish. Dad saw me in black lipstick one day. I thought he'd had a heart attack. Well, you threw the stool, and I threw my apron over the guy's head and ducked under the counter with Jerome. We didn't stand up until we heard sirens. A couple years earlier, there'd been a shotgun under the counter, but Cliff's wife made him take it out. We stand up, and the place is empty except for 2 dead people. The one guy, I guess he did look kinda like a biker, but he worked at the hardware store. The girl, I never knew who she was. Jerome wanted to slide out the back. I made him stay and back me up. Like you'd think. The cops had a million questions. I just told him what I saw and made Jerome do the same. They thought it was nuts, but 4 or 5 other people had come back after the cops showed up and told the same story, more or less. He poured coffee down the counter, refilled my cup, and told Rob, there's another thing where you're wrong. He didn't have bear claws. They were more like a cat. I saw him sheathe them. The girl he'd been sitting with, he pushed her away before the hardware guy jumped him. Then them claws popped back out after he pushed her out of reach. He tried to protect her, but she was the girl got killed in the window. 4th story. We visited the cemetery on Werewolf Road. We were always told not to venture out on Werewolf Road late at night when we were children, but one night we were just too damn determined to know why the teenagers from our small town were so frightened by the unnerving place that we had to see for ourselves. I had my small backpack loaded with snacks, a flashlight with spare batteries, a flare gun with a can of bear spray, and attached to my backpack was my sleeping bag. The 4 of us gathered together behind my cousin's house, who lived just 2 houses down across the street, and together we all exchanged scary legends and stories we had heard about the road and the cemetery on it. I heard there's a woman in the trees who jumps on people's cars late at night. She sleeps on a mattress with her dead, rotting baby. Evan said with a morbid sense of pride in his voice. That's baloney, my cousin Justin said, shaking his head. I heard she was just drunk and that happened once. The baby wasn't dead. The police took it from her though, he said in a matter-of-fact tone. You guys ever hear about the dead puppy in the box my brother found in the cemetery? I said aloud. The other three looked at me, their eyes widening with interest as I spoke up. He said he went up there alone one day around 2 years ago when we moved here. He said he was walking through the graveyard, and near one of the tombstones there was a purple box. He saw blood on the outside of the box and grabbed a stick to open it, and there was a dead puppy that someone sacrificed. He looked up and saw streamers in the trees and an area where it looked like there was a fire. For 4 adolescent boys with active imaginations, you could only picture how terrified we were. There would have been next to no possibility that we would venture out anywhere such as that alone. But together, it was a different story. We were all in this together, despite how frightening it was. Oh, come on. He's just jacking with ya. Ronnie, the youngest of us 4, spouted. I could tell if he was lying, and believe me, he wasn't. He had a look on his face that makes me feel like he wasn't. Are we gonna do this or not? Justin said, seemingly irritated by the stories. We each shrugged and picked up our belongings, and next thing we knew, we were walking towards the woods that led to the legendary road on the other side. The leaves and sticks cracked beneath our feet as we stumbled around in the pitch-black summer night. Justin had his flashlight shining ahead of our group. The narrow beam shone the heavy thicket that surrounded us. In some places you could see, even in the absence of light, the silhouettes of fast food litter like styrofoam cups of various sizes and plastic bottles or discarded cans that were scattered about. I felt the crunch of an empty beer can under my foot. I cursed under my breath as I realized just how loud and inconvenient my misstep was. Evan turned around and shushed me as we continued walking. Fuck off, Evan, I said in a stern but quiet voice. I raised my hand as he turned forward, the thought crossing my mind to smack the back of his head. I bit my bottom lip and considered how bad that could be for us if the wrong group of people noticed our presence. Okay, I can see the road. We need to decide right now if we are going to drop our stuff off first and then continue, or if we're going to take everything. Justin said. I looked around at the flat, dry ground that was covered in leaves nearby. That looks like a perfect area to set up camp, I said, pointing at the spot. We all 4 removed our bags as we walked over to the grounds I chose, setting them down. Anything valuable any of you might need to grab before we go? Justin asked. I ran to my bag and grabbed the bear spray, assuming it would be good just in case we ran into some trouble. Ronnie and Evan shook their heads and continued with him as he moved his flashlight from off our newly claimed campsite and headed for the cemetery on Werewolf Road. I quickly caught up to them as we continued. In the humid summer night, there wasn't a sound to be heard besides a barn owl that could be heard in a tree nearby, and our feet lightly moving across the earth. We reached the dirt road, and I raised my head and looked around as what sounded like something heavy fell through a mess of branches, perhaps a decrepit tree or a large animal. Whatever that was, it wasn't small. I heard Ronnie say. I looked over at him and was leaning over his bent knees, wiping his sweaty face off with his dark shirt. He raised up and shook it, attempting to cool off. We 4 sat in silence. The night now grew more ominous. We stared at the dirt road, and I now looked to the right, remembering the wooden bridge that led to the cemetery. It's this way, I said. We continued walking. I turned around to notice the rest of the group behind me, Justin still holding the flashlight, but aiming it up in the trees rather than the very dark road ahead. Justin, can I see the flashlight? I asked. "Here you go," he said as he quickly stretched his arm out and held it out like the Olympic torch. We approached the wooden bridge. As we came closer, I looked out at the creek, where you could see a pile of dead hogs, perhaps 6 or more, on the creek bed. The stench from their rotting, bloated corpses fouled the air. On the bridge was a pentagram drawn out near the very center. It had been faded from the elements, but you could still see it fairly well. We gathered around it, not saying a thing aloud. "The cemetery is just up the road," I said. We continued across the bridge, and I noticed that Ronnie turned his head and looked back at the creek where the dead hogs were. "Did you guys see that? Or smell it at least?" We continued walking, not thinking too much about it. There could have been many reasons for that. Not every little thing had to be unusual, even to young boys who longed for excitement. As we got closer to the cemetery, we noticed a bright light coming from inside its fence. It was a fire. We rushed down the road, trying our best to stay low and keep quiet as we grew dangerously closer to the cemetery. We got off the road and made our way up a ditch, which led us into the woods that surrounded the cemetery fence line. As we lined up to peer through the fence, we were careful to stay low. Embers lingered around the blaze like fireflies in the cemetery landscape, and we watched as these beings that gathered around the fire. They weren't human. There hadn't been a chance they were human at all. They were beastly, savage creatures that were swift on all fours. When they were on the lookout, they stood on their hind legs and perched, exposing their ape-like chests and torsos. The rest of their bodies looked more canine, like a greyhound. Their faces were covered in heavy, beaked masks that looked similar to the surgeon makes worn during the Black Plague, but these were more of a ghastly sight on such already terrifying monsters. I knew we couldn't dare trespass on their fiery territory. I watched as one lurked near a tombstone and dug like a canine into the ground. I listened as we could hear what sounded like gurgling coming from the plot, dirt being thrown viciously behind the creature. The rest of the pack began to gurgle and click their mouths as they walked around the fire. 3 other creatures gathered near the burial plot where the first creature dug, and the other 3 stood on their hind legs and looked around. I watched as the creature that was now burrowed deep in the ground climbed out of the hole with a rotting arm in its mouth. It sat next to the others, arm between its 2 hands, sniffing. The others gurgled and sniffed in between chirps. Another creature crawled into the hole and came back to the surface with a dismembered leg in its mouth and carried it away from the rest of the group. Justin looked over at the rest of us with a face full of shock, and he spoke very hesitantly in an almost faint whisper, trying his best to control his breathing. "We've got to get the hell out of here. I don't know what those things are, but they aren't people. I say we leave our stuff at the campsite and get back to my place fast." The 4 of us backed away from the fence, and we got as close to the bottom of the ditch as we could. We knew that any little noise from us could be fatal. The sticky summer air attracted unrelenting mosquitoes that swarmed around our ears and our sweaty necks and arms. We tried for our lives to ignore the high-pitched buzz that rang in our ears as we crept towards the bridge. I heard a gurgling sound in a nearby tree overhead. It rattled and clicked, signaling the others to move in on us. I looked up to see it as, through its frightening mask that covered its disfigured face, it looked down on me with its black, dilated pupils as I felt the sweat collect in my eyes and the mosquitoes I refused to away at bite into my neck. The other 3 were frozen in place, staring at the creature as well. I smelled urine in the air from Ronnie, as he couldn't anymore hold his bladder in fear. I couldn't blame him. There wasn't a moment for ridicule or disparagement. The creature stared into our eyes, and I heard the fence line viciously rattle as the other creatures climbed and jumped it, closing in on our misfortunate, desperate souls. Justin spoke up. Guys, any ideas? I slowly reached into my pocket and felt for a lighter. In my other pocket was the big can of bear spray. We let them close in on us dangerously to our discomfort, but I knew this was an ample opportunity to quickly discharge as much of the can on them as I could while we still had a chance. I watched as the creatures fell on their backs, croaking and clicking their tongues with this very awful and loud scream that came out in between gurgles and rattles. They nervously clicked more after this. The creature in the tree appeared to fear jumping. It leapt in the opposite direction, scurrying near the cemetery fire. We quickly rushed across the bridge, we jumping into the creek near the dead hogs and trudging through the water. It was only 5 minutes or less to Justin's home. The time we counted down together, not allowing failure to escape the grip of such vile and heinous of creatures. We saw the porch light nearby as we entered into the neighborhood. It had been a welcome relief to know that we had arrived finally. As I reached Justin's patio under the floodlight, I took a moment to catch my breath. I turned my head to look around, and I realized I had been the only one who reached my cousin's backyard. I called out each of their names, but without success. I waited around 5 minutes when I saw the beam of Justin's flashlight shine into the backyard from over the fence. I watched as him and Evan and Ronnie boosted each other over his fence as I continued to walk over to them and asked them what exactly kept them so long. I watched them, and something seemed different about their demeanors. They each had a look in their eyes that unnerved me. Justin spoke up. You left us behind. You didn't even let us catch up with you. What the hell were you thinking? He said angrily. I walked in circles, looking up at the three of them as they stared at me with unequivocal disapproval nonetheless. After the three of them refused to talk to me that night, I finally decided to walk home. As I got to my room, I quickly stripped to my boxers and fell onto my bed. I woke up around 8:30 in the morning to my father calling out to me from his office, and he said, "Tyler, come in here right now." I walked into my father's office. I watched as he held his bald fist over his mouth, leaning back in his leather chair. He ran his other hand through his hair and looked at me. "Your cousin and your friends are missing. What happened last night?" I thought about it for a moment, but hesitated on giving a full disclosure. "We just hung out till early this morning, and then I came home around 1 o'clock this morning. They were there when I left." "Did you go anywhere with them, or did they have somewhere they wanted to go?" He leaned forward. "The only place we went to was the cemetery on Werewolf Road." Fifth story. Wisconsin Wolfman. I posted an earlier version of this more than a year ago. My mind was racing on my first write-up here and my interview with Dogman Encounters here. I have now summed it up below with better thought-out information. I believe some parts are more accurate. Sighting was roughly at these coordinates, 45.983538, minus 92.359649, SE of our cabin. I think I wrote the first story when I was kinda dazed and accidentally gave a wrong direction. I'm fairly certain I may have seen a cryptid in NW, Wisconsin. Very wolf-like, and it definitely was not a bear. As well as I'm pretty sure wolves don't run upright. So I was 16 or 17, it was midsummer. We were at our cabin in NW, Wisconsin. I was with my cousin and grandparents for the weekend. I brought my airsoft gear. So me and my cousin are in mid-airsoft battle, and I took it more seriously than him. I was decked out in full BDU woodland camo, including the shamak. I retreated into the forest for better tactical advantage. So the way our land was set up is there is a trail that cuts around the border of the almost acre of owned forest. Our skirmish took us about 200 meters into the woods going up the right trail. So I'm a huge outdoorsman. I was introduced to hunting and survival training as well as firearms at a young age. I also had been practicing MMA for a few years at that point. The point is I'm not easily scared, and I'm comfortable in the wild. Now I'm 25 and now I have even more training. I respect the wild a lot more now. I was cocky back then. Anyway, here is where things get strange. Our battle had ended and we were standing at the edge of a slightly clearer area of forest and just talking. On the other side of the clearing is a hill that goes down to a small pond. Animals are a common sight around there as it's a watering hole. Now, as any experienced outdoorsman will know, most small animals will go about their business even when humans are around. Birds will still chirp and whatnot, but when a big predator is around, the forest goes dead quiet. So me and my cousin and talking, and I decided to freak him out, so I shushed him and whispered, "We're being watched." He got quiet. Then I realized that it was dead quiet. Not even birds chirping anymore. Then I got that feeling. You know when you feel like you are being watched, and when you feel it, you are. I went into hunter mode at this point and started scanning the clearing. I went from right to left, then back. On the second look through, I saw it. Its teeth are what gave it away as they contrasted with the background. Once I focused on it, I noticed a canid appearance in the head. It had dark reddish-brown hair/fur. Where it gets even stranger is it was leaning on a tree and had its front left arm gripping the tree. It appeared to have claws, and it was panting and staring in our direction, with its ears up, listening, while kneeling or crouching. I recognized it as a threat, as a predator, immediately. Now this all happened in the span of maybe 10 seconds before I said to my cousin, "We have to go." And he was a faster runner than me. When I said that I was still watching the animal, my cousin took off when he ran. The animal raised up and ran towards us and took a good 3 steps on 2 legs before I started to run. As I was turning to run, it appeared to have possibly been going to all 4s. I got to the fork in the trail to find my cousin waiting. I yelled, "Go, go, 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 go." And we ran back to the cabin. While running out, I could hear it crashing through the woods behind me, but it didn't follow beyond the tree line. At the time, I thought it had the intention to do harm, but now that I look back on it, I think it was just being either territorial or it was a bluff charge, because most animals can easily outrun humans on foot. If it really wanted one of us, it would have got us. I have tried to explain it away as being a bear or a big wolf, but what I saw just does not add up, and being a known animal, I'm still stumped by it. I was recently added to a group of people who have had sightings with similar sightings. They say mine falls in line with other sightings. They believe it to be a dogman, which I think is the cheesiest name they could have chosen. But I admit that what I saw is very similar, if not the same, as what others have claimed to see. I have different theories regarding the creature, though. I am normally very skeptical. However, I know that what I saw was not normal, and I am less skeptical than I used to be now. I wrote up this encounter before. In the past write-up, I was unclear with some details. Here is the old one. I am still nervous about the forests. I don't go into the woods alone or unarmed anymore. I'm not scared of any man, but I certainly don't want to see anything that looks like a werewolf again. By the way, all of this happened in broad daylight, if it wasn't clear. I will answer questions to clarify things. 4th story. We visited the cemetery on Werewolf Road. We were always told not to venture out on Werewolf Road late at night when we were children, but one night we were just too damn determined to know why the teenagers from our small town were so frightened by the unnerving place that we had to see for ourselves. I had my small backpack loaded with snacks, a flashlight with spare batteries, a flare gun with a can of bear spray, and attached to my backpack was my sleeping bag. The 4 of us gathered together behind my cousin's house, who lived just 2 houses down across the street, and together we all exchanged scary legends and stories we had heard about the road and the cemetery on it. I heard there's a woman in the trees who jumps on people's cars late at night. She sleeps on a mattress with her dead, rotting baby. Evan said with a morbid sense of pride in his voice. That's baloney, my cousin Justin said, shaking his head. I heard she was just drunk, and that happened once. The baby wasn't dead. The police took it from her, though, he said in a matter-of-fact tone. You guys ever hear about the dead puppy in the box my brother found in the cemetery? I said aloud. The other three looked at me, their eyes widening with interest as I spoke up. He said he went up there alone one day around 2 years ago when we moved here. He said he was walking through the graveyard, and near one of the tombstones there was a purple box. He saw blood on the outside of the box and grabbed a stick to open it, and there was a dead puppy that someone sacrificed. He looked up and saw streamers in the trees and an area where it looked like there was a fire. For 4 adolescent boys with active imaginations, you could only picture how terrified we were. There would have been next to no possibility that we would venture out anywhere such as that alone. But together, it was a different story. We were all in this together, despite how frightening it was. Oh, come on. He's just jacking with ya. Ronnie, the youngest of us 4, spouted. I could tell if he was lying, and believe me, he wasn't. He had a look on his face that makes me feel like he wasn't. Are we gonna do this or not? Justin said, seemingly irritated by the stories. We each shrugged and picked up our belongings, and next thing we knew, we were walking towards the woods that led to the legendary road on the other side. The leaves and sticks cracked beneath our feet as we stumbled around in the pitch-black summer night. Justin had his flashlight shining ahead of our group. The narrow beam shone the heavy thicket that surrounded us. In some places you could see, even in the absence of light, the silhouettes of fast food litter like styrofoam cups of various sizes and plastic bottles or discarded cans that were scattered about. I felt the crunch of an empty beer can under my foot. I cursed under my breath as I realized just how loud and inconvenient my misstep was. Evan turned around and shushed me as we continued walking. "Fuck off, Evan," I said in a stern but quiet voice. I raised my hand as he turned forward, the thought crossing my mind to smack the back of his head. I bit my bottom lip and considered how bad that could be for us if the wrong group of people noticed our presence. Okay, I can see the road. We need to decide right now if we are going to drop our stuff off first and then continue, or if we're going to take everything. Justin said. I looked around at the flat, dry ground that was covered in leaves nearby. That looks like a perfect area to set up camp, I said, pointing at the spot. We all 4 removed our bags as we walked over to the grounds I chose, setting them down. Anything valuable any of you might need to grab before we go? Justin asked. I ran to my bag and grabbed the bear spray, assuming it would be good just in case we ran into some trouble. Ronnie and Evan shook their heads and continued with him as he moved his flashlight from off our newly claimed campsite and headed for the cemetery on Werewolf Road. I quickly caught up to them as we continued. In the humid summer night, there wasn't a sound to be heard besides a barn owl that could be heard in a tree nearby, and our feet lightly moving across the earth. We reached the dirt road, and I raised my head and looked around as what sounded like something heavy fell through a mess of branches, perhaps a decrepit tree or a large animal. Whatever that was, it wasn't small. I heard Ronnie say. I looked over at him and was leaning over his bent knees, wiping his sweaty face off with his dark shirt. He raised up and shook it, attempting to cool off. We 4 sat in silence. The night now grew more ominous. We stared at the dirt road, and I now looked to the right, remembering the wooden bridge that led to the cemetery. "It's this way," I said. We continued walking. I turned around to notice the rest of the group behind me, Justin still holding the flashlight, but aiming it up in the trees rather than the very dark road ahead. "Justin, can I see the flashlight?" I asked. "Here you go," he said as he quickly stretched his arm out and held it out like the Olympic torch. We approached the wooden bridge. As we came closer, I looked out at the creek, where you could see a pile of dead hogs, perhaps 6 or more, on the creek bed. The stench from their rotting, bloated corpses fouled the air. On the bridge was a pentagram drawn out near the very center. It had been faded from the elements, but you could still see it fairly well. We gathered around it, not saying a thing aloud. The cemetery is just up the road, I said. We continued across the bridge, and I noticed that Ronnie turned his head and looked back at the creek where the dead hogs were. Did you guys see that? Or smell it at least? We continued walking, not thinking too much about it. There could have been many reasons for that. Not every little thing had to be unusual, even to young boys who longed for excitement. As we got closer to the cemetery, we noticed a bright light coming from inside its fence. It was a fire. We rushed down the road, trying our best to stay low and keep quiet as we grew dangerously closer to the cemetery.